Welcome to the Me, You and Data podcast, the podcast that uncovers insights from leading data science and analytics professionals globally to enable you to grow your career, teams and business. I'm Joseph Carla, your host and founder at 633 who bring you this podcast. We hope you get value from this episode. Hello everyone and welcome to another edition of the Me, You and Data podcast. I have a guest, an amazing guest for this final episode of season 2, and that is Mr. James Walker. James, thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure having you here. I could introduce you, I've known you long enough, but I'm going to let you have the honor because there's so much that I want to discuss. So if you could just give the listeners some insight into who you are, a bit about your experience, I guess, and then we'll kind of dive into the nitty gritty.
Thanks, Joseph. It's great to be here. I've seen so many of your other fantastic guests, so I'm delighted to be on the podcast with you.
Thank you.
In terms of my journey, I suppose I've been working in the world of data and analytics for the last 35 years, starting out long before data was big, initially working in advertising and advertising effectiveness using econometric models, long before ad tech was a thing. And I suppose I was one of the first mathsmen in advertising, as opposed to maybe one of the last of the madmen as well. And I suppose that was a niche I carved out for myself. And I was able to be successful really quite young and joined the board of JWT here in London and the European Management Group and then the Global Media Management Committee. And then was able to be part of the launch team for Mindshare, the media agency, where we created a whole first generation of computer-based media planning tools built around analytics. And, that was a fantastic experience. Yeah. And then in a different context, I moved into a couple of analytics startups. So we had Brand Science, which was a joint venture with Omnicom Media Group. Yeah. And then Edge with a number of my partners, people I'd worked with previously. And we extended out of marketing effectiveness into a broader range of sales and marketing. So price, promo, schemix, Salesforce effectiveness, customer analytics. And I suppose we were probably with those two businesses, the first or amongst the first of the analytics boutiques. And I think, we championed that analytics could be relevant in the world of sales and marketing. And I think we were, one of the early leaders in that space. Sure. And then we sold Edge to Accenture. Yeah. And we became the kernel around which we built Accenture Marketing Sciences, which grew into 400 people, $200 million of revenue. And over 7 years, I think we did 7 acquisitions and grew the business so that in the end, I was president international running Accenture Marketing Sciences in Europe and Asia and Latin America. Yeah. And then fast forward through a few other adventures. Last 7 years, I've been working at OC&C Strategy consultants, where we launched the analytics team within OC&C. And I think pioneered an interesting model, a sort of hybrid model of hybrid strategy and analytics consultants, which again turned out to be really successful. We built a global team of 35 people, not just in London, but folks in, Sydney, for example, as well. Yeah. I think, it's been a really interesting career in terms of being successful in those different contexts. Yeah. But if you were to ask me what was I proud of, it's probably being a champion for analytics, not just my success, but being at the forefront of driving analytics in those different contexts. In advertising and then a startup around being an analytics boutique. Yeah. And then being successful at Accenture, where we were their first acquisition. And then OC&C Strategy consulting. Being successful in those different contexts, I think is what's been interesting.
Yeah, lots of adventures and, keen to kind of dive into a couple of your experiences and stuff. But before I do, I just wanted to ask you, what is it like having a global career? Because, you spoke about Sydney and I know that you've worked all across the globe. How is it kind of working in different cultures and I guess having that success in those different contexts in vastly different environments globally?
I counted up the other day and yes, it's more than 400 projects in more than 40 countries, but it still has been quite a US and UK centric career in terms of building businesses and building a career. But it is true that I've done lots of projects in interesting places like China and India and Japan, and relatively recently quite a lot of work in Africa. So great to do projects in Uganda and Kenya and Ivory Coast, for example. And I think there are probably some tricks that means you can get established in a new country really fast.
Yeah.
Although you might not know the culture, you might not know the nuances of the market, there are just some things you can do in the first few days of working on a project. So the first is always de-average data. I was working with a client in Kenya, for example, who are a retailer of 400 sites in Kenya. And they were saying that they had like-for-like sales growth year on year of 5%, which sounds good. But actually, if you decompose that average, what you saw that of their 400 sites, about 200 were in growth, about 200 were declining. And it's only because the middle point was slightly above kind of zero that they ended up with 5%.
Okay.
And so you're actually able to say, well, quickly, let's look at what's going on with those stores that are underperforming. So they had about 25% of their stores that are actually doing negative growth, and look at the stores which were performing well and sort of compare and contrast them. Another way of landing quickly in a country and sort of understanding what's going on fast is to use the principle of different lenses.
Yeah.
So let's break down this problem in terms of customers, maybe intermediaries like wholesalers or retailers. Let's break down this problem in terms of commercial. So where are we making money? Which categories are we being successful in? So rather than thinking a problem very much just in terms of averages and try to understand what's going on in a new country in a very broad way, immediately try and decompose it into worst and best performing stores or brands or SKUs, or start looking at it in terms of consumers versus suppliers versus partners and breaking down the problem like that.
Yeah, no, and that's fantastic advice and something that I think people who are in a new country can do very quickly. So, and you've mentioned, like, obviously your career spans, 35 years, you've worked.
You make me sound very old.
You're not, but it spanned across this range. And, we know the Mad Men days of advertising, let's say, and kind of where we are now. How have you seen some kind of cultural things transition from when you entered the advertising industry and the consulting industry to where it is now? And where do you think it's kind of going with this new generation? Like, what are some key changes that you can kind of put your finger on?
Yeah, I think first of all, advertising was a fantastic grounding for me in my career. Yeah. What's really interesting about advertising is you have the different constituents coming together. You obviously have strategy or account planning, as it was called. You have creative, you have media planning, you have obviously the production of advertising. In my case, looking at the effectiveness of the advertising and creating a feedback loop to the strategy. So understanding and having respect for those different crafts, I think was very useful in terms of then later on in consulting and working with clients and understanding how those different components come together. I think slightly in advertising, that respect, we lost sight of it a little bit when we started to have media agencies that became these giants, and in themselves, actually, the data and the analytics kind of took over. And when you have obviously the whole ad tech industry and when you have programmatic trading, I think that's not a backward step, but it's been a big change from, I think, what I grew up with in advertising, where you could see the different components of advertising and how it all worked together. Yeah. And then in consulting, I think probably the biggest change that has happened is obviously around talent, as you would know, and that the talent now is so demanding in terms of what their career options and opportunities are. And I think they see jobs as a learning opportunity and as a stepping stone for what they do next, not necessarily intrinsically what they can do for me, but it's what we can do for them. And I think we have to recognize that. And certainly during the latter part of my time at OC&C as a partner there, we were moving very much to a people-first model. And in a sense, thinking much more about our proposition to talent, almost more than our proposition to our clients, because if we build a great place for the talent, clients will come because of that talent. So it's a sort of talent-first model. Yeah. So I think in consulting, it's very much this kind of talent focus, which I think has has been really the big change I've seen.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic insight. And just to kind of draw some more wisdom just on that point, because I think, James, there's a lot of companies, there's a lot of partners in consulting. I'm speaking to a lot of them who are really struggling to find the right type of talent or keep the right type of talent. So from that people-centric model that you've been building at OC&C, what are some things that you could advise perhaps other partners or leaders to try to focus on to make their business attractive?
Well, one thing I think we have done in the analytics group is being realistic about people will leave.
Yes.
And you want a proposition for talent where people can choose to stay and go through the ranks of manager, associate partner, and build an attractive career model that follows that track. But equally, we want people to be successful, whether they're an associate consultant or a new manager, and accepting that this might be a stepping stone for them going to work in private equity or starting their own analytics boutique.
We'll come on to that.
And so realizing that there is this contract, if you like, an unspoken contract between ourselves and talent, I think has probably been the big change.
Yeah.
And accepting that people might actually do different things, maybe work in private equity, but actually come back to consulting afterwards.
Yeah.
And that you can't hold on to people.
Yeah.
And I think once you realize that, it's actually very liberating, and you can help people if they're honest with you that they only want to spend 2-3 years with you. You can say, well, let's enjoy this journey together, and perhaps even make sure that the job they do get when they leave is the right one for them. Make sure it's a sort of right home for those people, given what you've learned about them in terms of the strengths and weaknesses, rather than sort of trying to hang on to people at all costs. So I think for me, that's my personal observation, I think.
That's fantastic. And I think from doing that, you build happier staff, and then coincidentally, you build a alumni network, if you will, of quite strong consultants that can still chip in, you share information and stuff. And I think that's kind of worked quite well for OC&C as well. So one of the things I wanted to kind of touch on as well, because you have worked in different types of startup, advertising, consulting, what are some differences and similarities from your experience that you can kind of see from the different contexts in which you've worked?
Yeah, certainly in consulting, I would say there's more that's similar than there is that's different. So in consulting, whether it's a small startup or a giant firm like Accenture or a sort of medium-sized firm like OC&C, you have to sell work, deliver work, innovate new propositions, build a team, motivate that team. So I think they are in many ways very similar and more similar than people might imagine. Yeah. The differences are probably that in a small startup, you're obviously looking at your partners across the table and you have to go sell some work and get people to come and work for you who might be a bit nervous about working in a smaller startup. So genuinely selling work and genuinely getting people on board to work with you. I think that's a sort of spike you see with a smaller firm. Yeah. And then with someone like Accenture, I think it is true that, you say work and do work and so on, but you've got to manage against the metrics. And the scorecard is constantly changing to keep you on your toes. So is it sales? Is it chargeability of your team? Is it margin? And then at OC&C and strategy concerning, I think overall, I think there's a responsibility to your partners to be at the top of your game and to be the smartest that you can be in a project. You normally have 2 or 3 partners on a project. You're teaming together and sort of synthesizing with each other. You shouldn't necessarily fight for your own idea. You should be able to defend your idea, but build on it with other people, kind of greenhouse that idea. Yeah. So I think being able to bring your A game to your interactions with other partners and clients is what's true of strategy consulting. So I think they are all the same in terms of sell work, do work, build a team, manage people, but with slightly different spikes, depending on the context of small firm versus big firm.
Yeah. And you touched on this a little bit, but what are some spikes or differences as it relates to the skill set of the individual required in those different contexts, especially, I guess, as it relates to kind of startups and boutiques, which sometimes require different skill set?
Yeah, whether you are, just getting your startup together, perhaps with your pals upstairs room of a pub, getting together the first time. Or even in a more mature context, there's probably still the balance of managing reality and perception.
Yeah.
And I think in terms of managing reality, you probably want to be able to create your own clients, whether it's you and 2 or 3 partners, you divide up, people perhaps, and sort of have a divide and conquer approach where you try and build your business.
Yeah.
So you always got to feel, I think, responsible for bringing some revenue to the table, some meat to the barbecue.
Yeah.
And I think that's the sort of top of the pyramid.
Yeah.
And I think, again, whether it's a startup or, a firm like OC&C a bit bigger, you probably want to be able to build a proposition that you own, but which enables other people to be successful so that you enable other people to sell work.
Yeah.
It's not just a question of what you do. You want to be able to create a new proposition for marketing effectiveness or pricing and promo that other people can then take to market. And I think also, again, whether it's a startup or an OC&C size company, you want to be able to grow a team of people and manage that team of people. And I think in a startup, that's about attracting talent because those people might not want to work with a small firm, perhaps untested, no track record of what the exit, opportunities are afterwards. And a firm like OC&C, it's much more around, I think, managing talent, pitching that talent internally. Sometimes you have some folks who you think are fantastic, and as part of coaching them, you want to push them forward. They may have 1 or 2 kind of projects that don't go as well as you would have hoped. And so you have to sort of put an arm around them and still kind of pitch them out, internally to your partners. So I think it's about building that team and looking after the team.
Yeah.
But I do think it's kind of not that dissimilar, regardless of context. It's about this balance between selling your own work, building a platform of propositions that enables other people to be successful, and then building out a team to deliver that work. I think in a sort of much bigger firm like a Big Four and Accenture, perhaps there's a little bit more onus on building out a large delivery group, because owning a large delivery group gives you claim on their revenue.
Yes, of course.
So if you build
I did that.
if you build a team that is doing lots of pricing work, pricing is obviously very hot at the moment, then hey, you've got a team of 100 pricing specialists.
Yeah.
You can deploy those people on all kinds of projects, and it's not just the work that you're working on or your propositions. Oh, hey, actually, I built a useful team. So I think that's a little bit more what you see in a larger business.
Yeah, no, fantastic advice. And I think, like, I've heard you speak about, as it relates to advice that you would give to kind of junior partners, and you shared some of that there, especially as it relates to the perception versus reality piece. Do you mind going into that?
I think, there's the reality that we've talked about in terms of selling work of your own, having a platform of products and innovating your own propositions, and having a team that's yours, either a small team that's doing your work or a larger team that enables you to claim revenue for a broader base of projects. And I do think there is a sort of perception to be managed that young partners should be aware of. And that perception probably also has 3 components. I think there's a perception of the types of projects that you're selling. So regardless of the revenue, is it high impact at the client? And it could be high impact in terms of a strategy project where you're working with the exco or with the board.
Yeah.
So that's one of the reasons why strategy consulting, even in Accenture or a Big Four, although it's lower revenue, tends to be recognized as important. So high impact at the client. Obviously, managing perception in terms of your area of the firm being in growth, so that one of the growth pillars of the firm might be analytics or AI or whatever, but you want to be seen as kind of where the growth is. Yeah. And I think a third element is also being seen as influencing the overall direction of the firm. Again, whether it's an OC&C or an Accenture, relatively junior partners can actually be very influential. So, for example, OC&C recently went through the process of becoming a B Corp.
Yep.
Everyone at OC&C is very proud of that. But I think it was largely driven by one partner with a determination to make it happen. A relatively junior partner in the organization, but who made that happen.
Yeah.
Similarly, with AI at the moment, we are seeing that there's quite a transformation, in terms of what AI can bring in terms of how we deliver projects and the types of projects that we deliver. But again, that has been driven by a relatively junior partner in the organization who will punch above their weight in terms of having an influence in the firm. So I do think that junior partners shouldn't be overly focused on, oh, hey, I got promoted to do X. Actually, they should be building up their platform in terms of innovation, building their teams, in terms of the reality of what they're doing, and then managing perception in terms of saying, hey, I'm having an impact at my clients because I'm working with the Exco.
Yeah.
I'm having an impact in the firm because I'm driving, the growth, but also having an impact in the firm in terms of the direction of the firm, in terms of their overall strategy.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic advice, because I think that it gives junior partners a holistic approach to kind of build their career around. And, if you're managing the perception and actually enacting the reality, you should have a good career, or at least you'll have a folder of achievements which kind of point to you being successful and valuable to your team.
Yes, what's interesting is one of the roles which I'm continuing to serve OC&C around as a senior advisor is helping secure my successor and helping the firm to hire a new head of analytics. And what's interesting as you interview people and you meet people working at other firms is just how poor they are at articulating what they are achieving in terms of, is it, revenue or innovation of the platform or building out a team? And they're also poor with their stories about how they're contributing more broadly to their employees or their partnerships in terms of what they're bringing outside of their immediate, clients. And I think too many people just say, oh, hey, I've got this client. It's a big retailer or it's a big CPG, and don't think in a far more rounded way about what we're interested in terms of how do you go from junior partner to senior partner, and how do you actually become an influential player around the table in terms of being a person of substance in the partnership.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic insight. And as it relates to the partnership, as you know, a lot of my network and the audience are kind of at that partner level or junior partner level, or some at just below that, kind of trying to work their way up. What advice would you give partners who are currently for the first time embarking on that partnership process? Because it can be grueling, it can be tough. They have internal sponsors and stuff, but you've been through it, you've interviewed lots of people. What advice can you share?
Actually, funny enough, I've never been through it.
The partner process?
No, I've never been an internal promote.
Not internal promote, but for example, when you place you at OC&C, you had to speak to like all of these partners and long process and stuff.
I think there's a big difference between being an external candidate and an internal candidate.
There is.
So I think as an internal candidate, you're competing with a lot of people, all of whom will have a great form, a great business case. But I think you have to stand out. And I think, we talked about balancing reality and perception. We've talked about having clients and having your kind of platform case. But I think in terms of internal promotes, you got to think of the world in terms of the people who are going to promote you. There'll be some kind of committee, and they will be looking at what really makes you stand out. And imagine an airplane flying along at 30,000, 40,000 feet, and you're looking down. Yes, you may have been a partner who's done a lot. You've built a lot of relationships. You've got quite a few projects going on. But actually, what will make you stand out probably is one big thing. So yes, you need to balance perception and reality with those 6 things I've talked about. But in your year as a promotion candidate, I think you need to have one thing that is a big spike. It needn't actually be sales. It could be that you've built out your team and capability. It could be that you've had an incredibly successful new proposition. It could be that you've influenced the firm, people agenda, B Corp, AI, those kind of big shifts. So I think internal candidates, you've got to have a reason to believe, one thing that committee notices that makes you distinct from the other people who are up for, partner candidate that year. And then in terms of external promotes, and I've interviewed a lot of external partner candidates, I think it's been able to crisply articulate one example in each of the 6 boxes I've talked about.
Yeah.
So crisply articulate who is your client, the meat you'll bring into the barbecue. What is your platform, and demonstrate success. Tell me a story about how you invented a proposition, how it became successful for other people to sell it. Tell me about how you've built a team and managed that team, because building a team is incredibly important to hiring in an external partner. And then I think, to demonstrate you're a rounded person we want to have around the leadership table, we also want someone who can talk more broadly around client impact, more broadly around how they're going to shape the growth of the firm, and more broadly around the future strategy of the firm, and bring something new. Because whether it's OC&C, with 600 or 700 people in the firm, or Accenture with 650,000 people, it's about what is it that's new and incremental that you bring. Not too crazy that you're going to have organ rejection and not fit in, but nevertheless, you have to be incremental and different, because there's some great people already in the firm. So you have to bring something that's going to be useful to have around the table as an addition.
Yeah, for sure. And you've mentioned this a few times, and I think it's really important to point out for the audience, just to put emphasis on the fact that you can have all of these great projects, you can have all of this fantastic experience, but if you can't articulate it correctly and in a way where it makes sense, it's not going to really vibe with the partner that you're speaking to. Do you mind just speaking a little bit to how partner candidates can kind of best articulate their value, and like any tips that kind of you've come across which have helped you to do that effectively?
Yeah, I think what I've seen from very successful candidates is a crispness in saying, this is what I will bring that you don't do already. I think a crispness in terms of saying, here's an example of how in my current firm, we are doing something new that I invented, and we weren't doing it before, now we are, and it's very successful.
Yeah.
So it's a storytelling. But I think there has to be a balance in terms of self-confidence versus arrogance.
Yeah.
Likability beats competence.
Competence, yeah.
Perhaps we'll talk about that a bit later.
Yeah, for sure.
You ultimately have to have partners that you want to work with. And so are you excited by that person, that you're going to want to team with them? Because whether it's a Big Four, or Accenture, or indeed OC&C, it's a team sport. And you go to market to see clients together, you deliver projects together, and you're going to want someone who you are happy to have in the team room. Yes, you want someone who's doing something different to you're doing at the moment, but you've got to be confident that they're going to be enjoyable to work with and fun to work with.
Yeah.
Nobody wants a talented jerk.
Yeah, no, for sure.
And I think sometimes in the interview process, I've seen a lot of people get it wrong. Either they are too much on the talented jerk end of the spectrum, or they're too much, thinking about it's just about commercial intent, their story in terms of, hey, I got this revenue and these clients. Either not telling
no personality
enough of the story, which is rounded around how I've contributed to growth, or how I've contributed to new ways of thinking, or new overall strategy of the firm. So it's, I think, a balance of things that you've got to get right in terms of the storytelling when you arrive. But most of all, you've got to excite the partners. As you know well, from my journey joining OC&C, you meet literally 30, maybe even more partners. Yeah. There's a lot of coffee and cocktails along the way. Yeah. And you have to be good at telling your story in terms of, yes, I'm excited by this individual, that they're going to be great to have join our club, our partnership. Yeah. They are diluting their earnings, certainly during the initial years, to have you join. Hopefully it's a bet that pays off. Yeah. But people are very precious about you joining their club. And so you have to be a very convincing candidate to join that club.
Yeah, no, fantastic advice for the partners out there who are kind of on that journey and going on that journey. Maybe we could take a step back and look at the junior candidates who are kind of currently just starting out their career. Any specific pearls of wisdom for those in consulting? Obviously, you've got consulting is like a family business to you at this point, but what advice can you kind of give to people to be successful?
Yes, I'm smiling because my former OC&C team would be sick of my advice. And indeed, at my leaving dinner, I gave my 70-minute speech on my advice for the youngsters. Yeah. I do think, though, it's about personal branding and standing out. Whether you're joining a Big Four and Accenture or a firm like ours at OC&C, you obviously join with a cohort of people. And out of that cohort of 40 people who join a year, perhaps 2 will become partners.
Yeah.
So you are competing with, a ratio of 20-1 to stand out with a 10 or 12-year journey to get to be a partner. And it's about, well, what is your personal brand? Of course, everyone's smart. Of course, everyone is great at presenting. Of course, everyone, brings great analysis skills. But what is it that you're going to be doing in terms of innovation, new ways of doing something? We had a youngster joined only a year ago at OC&C who built out a whole new proposition, a whole new set of ideas for us. Just a year out of university, very, very impressive young man. Someone else, a little bit older, but built out a new digital due diligence proposition that we kind of rolled out in some of our deals support work, looking at e-comm digital native businesses. So I think it's important to sort of zag, not zig. You got to be someone that you recognize as someone a little bit special, and you can't just turn up and do your job and expect that to be enough. You need to do more than simply just turn up and do what you're told.
Yeah. So stand out, be almost entrepreneurial, be proactive in kind of how you work at your business, basically.
Yeah, you got to be an entrepreneur within the organization. And number one is certainly standing out in terms of having ideas, innovating, not just being, one of the pack where you're doing what you're told. I think a second thing is genuinely social skills. Staffing in any firm is Darwinian. You get staffed on projects on the basis of your performance and who wants to work with you. It is a little bit like a school playground and people picking you to play football with. I want him or her in kind of sequence. That's how staffing works in any firm in reality. And so you have to build relationships. And so if you're working with a manager you've got on a project, you should cultivate that relationship and go for coffee and, see if there's a kind of mentorship opportunity there. And similarly with the partners, partners are always up for engaging with young men and women in terms of trying to help them, with their careers. And we're always looking for people who are interested in the craft of consulting.
Yeah.
And so, never be shy in terms of asking a partner to go for coffee or, go for drinks if that's your thing, and build relationships with those people, because it is very much about working with people who want to work with you.
Yeah. No, for sure. It's a people's business. And we spoke about entrepreneurs, and obviously we've have a close contact in David Whitcomb, who was on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, who I placed when he was a young whippersnapper at OC&C, fresh out of IBM. He spent a couple of years there and, was really successful for you, and has kind of branched out to set up his own business. What advice would you give for other young professionals who have entrepreneurial aspirations? Because we've seen in David's kind of first 2 years, he's doing really well, really ramping up right now.
Yes, I'm an investor as well in data vision. And I think actually I do have a track record of supporting talent that I've worked with and in different contexts then investing in their businesses. So my good friend Laurent Collard in New York worked with me at Accenture. He then had very senior roles at WPP and went on to set up an ad tech business, which I invested in, which we exited last year. One of my clients, and then at Kellogg's, and then a longtime partner together at Accenture, Jeff Merrihew. I invested in MoFilm, which we exited to you and Mr. Jones. So I think you invest in people.
Yeah.
And without getting into the details of David's proposition with data vision, I think it's a great proposition at a high level. Ex-strategy consultant talent, but able to deliver projects that are closer to the offshore rates that you have with, some of these other firms, because it's a 21st century business with lower overheads and, doing really great work in the PE space around VCP work, value creation work. So I think, it's a combination of spotting the right talent and investing in people, investing in talent, perhaps more so than the business idea. And you need one good idea. In David's case, I think it was the idea of working with PE houses on VCP work with great talent and an attractive rate. With Laurent in New York, it was taking his experience of having senior roles in WPP in media agencies and translating that into an ad tech business. And I think, in terms of what I see as what makes those people successful is them in turn be able to replicate that in terms of the people they hire.
Yeah.
And you become successful by having, not what you do, you become successful by hiring great people. And David, now at Data Vision, has already 9 or 10 people. Yeah. And, they're all great because he's handpicking those people to build his team. It's the early days, and those people will, hopefully be with that business as it grows and becomes even more successful. Similarly with my friend Laurent in New York with his ad tech business, his early team were people we knew back from Accenture, back from a long time ago, who he trusted. And so he put together a team of people he trusted. So I think as a supporter and an investor, I'm looking for people who I want to help, and equally those people who have become entrepreneurs and are building their businesses. It's all about the first 10 hires you make in terms of building up a great team that's going to then grow with you and be successful.
Yeah, no, fantastic. And I think there's a lot of gems there in what you just mentioned, James, because junior talent coming up. So David, as a case study or example, right? He was successful. He stood out. You wouldn't invest in someone you didn't believe in. He built a relationship with you, rapport, and then he's kind of gone on and delivered on that kind of one big idea. So I think it's important that people show their talent where they are, because you don't know what relationships you can kind of build off that can then help you in later adventures as well. Yeah,
no, absolutely. And we got I think, a very strong, as you talked about, ex-OC&C diaspora, who are now at the PE houses, now, in quite senior roles, running analytics teams, number 2, number 3 within analytics teams, those houses. And I think it's quite likely that several of those people, in fact, will then go off and set up their own analytics houses. And I think as AI excites PE houses and some of those leaders of those analytics teams are actually getting more interested in AI, I think that leaves a bit of a gap for delivering on VCP around pricing, Salesforce and CRM that then can be filled by the boutiques. So I'm anticipating perhaps some other of our friends who are now sitting, leading analytics teams in PE houses to go off and do similar businesses to Data Vision.
Yes, no, I'm assuming so. And you spoke a little bit about, obviously you're kind of like a godfather of consulting and advertising and have mentored successfully a lot of individuals who have gone on to have success. Have you had any mentors or similar profiles in your career as you've kind of, gone on your adventures?
I think I had an accidental mentor early in my career. You would never really know this, but a guy I worked with in my 20s called Lawrence Hagen, when we were doing a lot of marketing effectiveness work, and we did some amazing projects in Japan and had all kinds of adventures. And Lawrence was quite an inspiration for me because he had a Bentley and a house with tennis courts and had this fantastic lifestyle of soaring around the world first class and eating in amazing restaurants and drinking fantastic wine.
Sounds like you, James.
Indeed, he was a role model. And I'm sure he wouldn't mind me saying so. But despite the Bentley and the tennis courts and the fine wine and the restaurants, he was not exactly a baller. He was really quite a nerdy guy. And I thought, oh, hang on, the meek shall inherit the earth. And it inspired me that, we can actually make some serious money out of analytics. And then in a more functional way, more specifically, what Lawrence did was he was an entrepreneur. So he made his first chunk of cash by building what we'd call insights and analytics team, not heavyweight analytics, but an insight and analytics team within an advertising agency, became quite senior. And then the advertising agency sold itself and he got a chunk of money. And then he had very good success with a series of smaller analytics boutiques, one in the automotive industry, one in the kind of marketing mix industry, that he exited one by one, probably each for only £2 or £3 million. But, you build up that portfolio of businesses, it adds up to quite a chunk of money.
Yeah.
And so he was inspiring in many, many different ways, but I think inspired me to see analytics as a business opportunity. Whereas before I'd been excited at university about analytics and econometrics, and then working in advertising, I'd sort of seen a niche to do something that made me stand out and I felt special. But it's working with Lawrence that made me realize, oh yeah, there's actually a business here that can make us quite a lot of money.
Yeah, no, it's like interesting how people can unknowingly shape your journey, right? And I know you did some work North America, Accenture. Did you ever come across Pat Cummins?
Yeah, so Pat Cummins and I worked together within Accenture Marketing Sciences. We divided the leadership roles. So Pat ran North America, and I had what Accenture calls international, which is everything outside North America. So I had Europe, Latin America, and Asia. Yeah. So I think he was president North America, and I was president international.
International, yeah.
I see Pat from time to time in New York, he is irrepressible, I think is how I would describe Pat.
It's such a small world, but when Pat with Ipsos MMA expanded into the UK in, I think 2016 was the first time, 2016, 2017, I placed a bunch of people in his team, and I remember going to meet him for lunch, and irrepressible
came home 2 days later.
It was like a memorable lunch meeting. He might still remember because that was 8 years ago or something. But it's interesting how paths cross, and the people who you're successful with at one company, you can kind of enter into partnerships with them at other companies, or indeed get referrals for investments and stuff like that, which kind of has been a bit of the story of your career.
Yes, I mean, in terms of mentor or inspiration, whether formal or otherwise, talking of Pat actually reminds me of Jeff Merry, who we both worked for at Accenture Marketing Sciences. Yeah. He was our global lead. He was the person that acquired our business. But I have known Jeffrey through many different contexts. Originally at J. Walter Thompson,
yes,
where he was European CMO of European Marketing Director at Kellogg's. And so as a client, and we created a joint venture, one of the first, I think, in the media world, between what eventually became Mindshare and then Kellogg's, so Kellogg's European Management. So that was a new thing. Again, back to my point of innovation and zagging, not zigging.
Yeah.
We were, I think, the first to deploy some of the computer-based media planning tools that I've talked around in terms of mixed media planning and things like moving to much lower strike weights in terms of focusing on reach rather than frequency and extending the length of campaigns, but more kind of drip than burst. So we did a lot of new things together. And then he had other ventures and ended up as a senior partner at Accenture. And then he acquired Edge. And so we then folded Edge into Accenture and were the kernel around which we built Accenture Marketing Sciences. And Jeffrey, I think I learned a lot from in terms of, we're pitching to buy, to acquire companies to fold into AMS. And I think we did 7 in 7 years. And I would often go to the capital committee first. I would be the sort of first, I'd go in and make the pitch. I'd fail. No, we're not going to do this. Then Jeffrey would go in. And again, just never taking no for an answer and super high energy in terms of, if you want to build something, it is extremely difficult. People will always say no to whatever you say. I want to buy this business. I want to hire this team.
Yeah.
The first instinct in any organization is always to say no. And so I think I learned from Jeffrey to embrace that and say, right, nothing is easy. And therefore, you're going to be knocked back 2 or 3 times if you want to do something. Fantastic. And then, later on in another context, we did MoFilm together. Yeah. I invested in MoFilm with Jeffrey. And again, never taking no for an answer in terms of building out the proposition, which in essence was a very 21st century ad agency type model where we were running effectively crowdsourced film ad making competitions on behalf of big brands. So Super Bowl, very much top of our minds this week.
Yeah.
So we
It's
actually
Sunday.
made Chevrolet's Super Bowl ad for a couple of years.
Amazing.
And to get that, you got to knock down some
Because everyone
doors.
wants that slot.
Yeah, and then I think what was really interesting about MoFilm is again rethinking the model. We initially kind of were very focused on advertisers who were our clients, and how do you build a book of business, rather than necessarily thinking about the talent of young filmmakers. And then we flipped the model and actually focused on the talent and went to film schools, attracted young filmmaking talent. And then that in turn, if you've got the talent, clients will come. So not quite build it and they will come, but certainly flipping the model that you got to be very focused on the talent when that's what you're selling. And I think Jeffrey was really good about that as well at MoFilm, flipping conventional thinking in terms of, it's not just about getting the clients, it's about getting the talent that secondarily, second order will then get you the clients.
No, fantastic. And I think that shows the importance of both formal mentorship and kind of informal mentorship as well, right? And what I wanted to get into now, James, is just really understanding what your view and experience has taught you about data science and analytics, like what your kind of manifesto is and how you view it and how you've seen that view kind of be implemented at several different clients and on projects.
Yes, I suppose I do have a manifesto or way of thinking, which typically it's not the data science or the analytics per se that matters. What matters more is the framework of the thinking. Okay. So for example, I was working with a retailer last year who had a perfectly competent analytics department, but we're looking at pricing in terms of SKU by SKU performance, as opposed to thinking of the category as a whole, as an overall system, and thinking of how SKUs interacted with each other. So if you increase the price of one SKU, yes, it will lose volume, but some of that volume will flow to other SKUs because of substitution. And I don't think that their thinking was sufficiently sophisticated in terms of the analytical framework, even if the individual SKU models were great in themselves in terms of, the R squared or, the p-values of the analytics per se. I just think they completely missed what they should have been building in terms of a systems model and a superior framework. And in a similar way, we'd often see with something like advertising effects. People will be looking at the sales uplift you get from advertising, but not necessarily thinking about the persistence of advertising effects over time, or how if you have a mixed portfolio of products, how do those products work as a portfolio together with brand halos against each other, or maybe volumes cannibalizing each other. So again, thinking much more of a system as opposed to, individual products and individual models. I think another example I would give would be around markdown in apparel e-comm. Often people will say, hey, we've got some unsold product. We need to reduce the price to sell that unsold inventory. But one of the problems is people weren't buying that product in the first place. Maybe it's not so attractive. And so it has a very low price elasticity. So no matter how much you discount it, the increase in sales you achieve is very low, typically price elasticity with markdown of -2, in fact. And that just means that the sales you would have got, all of the profit on the sales is completely wiped out. If you have a price elasticity of -2 for a markdown, obviously the extra sales you achieve are just in balance, with the profit loss that you lose in terms of, the sales you would have got. And then of course you cannibalize, sales that would have been at full margin. And it's an interesting system model because if you have a price elasticity of -2, your cannibalization of other SKUs in the portfolio is probably 50%. If it's -3, it's probably 67%. If it's -4, it's probably 75%. There's a relationship which you can build in a system model. And if you plug in those values into a simulation model, there is no answer with a markdown that will ever give you a value positive result. No matter what values you have for price elasticity and the associated cannibalization that results, markdown can never ever pay out. It's always going to be value destroying. And in fact, you'd be better off putting the product as a free gift, in a pack when someone orders, some other product. Just throw it in there as a free offer because it can never actually pay out as a positive contribution. And I think the data science doesn't always pick that up because people aren't looking to build more holistic models of, how a business works in totality, as opposed to just looking at maybe one SKU at a time or one category.
Yeah. And your skill set and experience, because a lot of emphasis sometimes or overemphasis can be put on the data science and the analytics and the numbers without actually thinking about the systems and the questions, as it relates to your skill set, which is kind of a blended skill set from a bit of a data nerd, but very commercial business guy. How did that kind of come about? What was the genesis of that? Did you start heavily hands-on data and then kind of move into business? How did that come about to allow you to kind of have this view which has seen you become successful?
Yeah, and absolutely. So I studied economics at university and then became interested in econometrics, and my time in advertising was spent very much green screen coding, micro TSV on a VAX mainframe, tear off sprocket paper on the printer. And then moved into eViews, which was an early econometrics package, PC-based. And then as we moved into Edge, we actually developed our own tools for particularly econometrics around price promo, SKU mix, Salesforce, marketing effectiveness using regression analysis. But no, I absolutely started out my life hands-on as an analytics person. And even now, I'm coding in SQL, MySQL, which is really interesting. It's sort of partway between proper coding and sort of low code, no code. I think ripe for AI.
Ripe for AI.
For sort of natural language. So I think that's to me is interesting. I don't really understand these people who say you can be a analytics leader without ever having done any analytics. You can't be a racing car driver, I don't think, unless you kind of understand the engineering of the car. And then I think just naturally it morphed into seeing the opportunity to be an entrepreneur as well, partly inspired by Lawrence Hagen and his Bentleys and tennis courts and fine wine and first-class travel. But I think, it's you can never make money by chasing that goal. I think you just got to do something you feel inspired to do, and you think you have a point of difference that you can do it better than anyone else. And I think then commercial success will follow. So I think that's really how I've ended up with a balance between kind of nerdy quant skills, but also being an entrepreneur.
We call that a unicorn in most circles. No, but because it is sometimes very difficult to get people who have a nice blend and understanding of both. And you see the people that do, they make my life easy as a recruiter because they're easy to sell in. I don't even need a CV. I can just explain what their skills are.
I think certainly in my client work, that's reflected as well. So yes, I think it's important to do really great analytics in terms of what you can bring to clients. But I think also it's important to put it in the context of what commercial decision are we supporting? And I think I've always been really good at getting that balance right in terms of having analytics that is fit for purpose, but easy enough to explain to the client, and then doing the analytics based around the frameworks we've talked about. And I think, example of that probably would just be metrics. And I think I've been able to bring some value to clients recently in the e-com space where I think they were fixated on incorrect metrics because they hadn't necessarily understood what the metrics really meant. And I think particularly in the world of PE-owned e-com businesses, mid-maturity of their growth, there's some misunderstanding of what the metrics should be in terms of initially diligence metrics for looking at the business and then looking at what those metrics should be in terms of tracking. So to give you a few examples of those where I think I've been able to balance my analytics and nerdiness, but also commercial understanding would be CAC, so customer acquisition cost. It's beloved by PE houses as a simple metric, but actually it's a terrible metric for both diligence because it's very unstable. It's a terrible metric for performance tracking because it combines together two very separate metrics that can often go into different directions. So customer acquisition costs in an e-com context combines together cost per click. So the advertising costs are driving people to the site, generally speaking with PPC advertising. And then quite differently, quite separately, conversion on site, which is very much a kind of UX type metric. So often in the organization, they'll be owned by completely different people, have no control over what each other are doing. But moreover, as the diligence metric, they are very unstable when you combine the two together. They are like nitro and glycerin. Because as a business matures, cost per click has a reasonably predictable profile in terms of how you spend more money on PPC, your cost per click will increase steadily. But conversion rates tend to initially improve as the UX experience gets better on the site. But then you reach a point of maturity where you're bringing in, with your PPC advertising, more marginal customers, and your conversion rates suddenly start deteriorating very fast. And if you have a rapid deterioration in your on-site conversion and a rapid increase in your cost per click, suddenly your CAC goes exponential. And it's very hard to predict at what point that happens from looking at CAC history in terms of diligence. So I think it's far more important to look at those individual underlying metrics of cost per click and how that is evolving and what's underpinning that in terms of PPC performance. And then it's important to look at, UX and conversion on site and what's going on there, as opposed to combining those two metrics together. I mean, it's the archetypal metric of, one hand on the barbecue and one hand on the ice bucket. Kind of on average, you're fine. But it's kind of a bit crazy to combine them together into one metric. And then, the other metric that my analytics and my commercial hat has made me question somewhat, again, in the e-comm context, is customer lifetime value. So everyone thinks, well, CLTV is an easy metric. But the reality is in most e-comm, the actual number of customer transactions and a CLTV is very low. So in apparel e-comm, it is often as low as 2. So CLTV is based upon 2 transactions on average. But if you unpick that a little bit, it's 70% of people who make 1 transaction only and 30% of people who repeat. And yes, they might eventually make 4 transactions. But typically, the first transaction happens on the first anniversary, the 12-month anniversary of the first transaction. And so you have a CLTV based on 2 transactions on average, which is double actually the value you have with 70% of your customers. And so I think a much more useful set of metrics is actually just first basket value. So are you making money on the first basket? Yes or no? And then secondly, what percentage of customers repeat to a second transaction? Is it 30%? Is it 31%? Is it 32%? And improving that metric is kind of all important, because in the second and third transaction that follow is somewhat dependent on, do you actually get people to make a second transaction? And all of that has to happen within the first year, because otherwise all these e-coms go bust. There's no point in saying, hey, I got a fantastic CLTV based on 2 or 3 transactions, but by the way, they all happen in year 2. So I think it's much more around first basket value, percentage of people who actually make a second transaction, and then what value is realized in year 1. So I think that's a great example of where my working in the trenches in terms of actually doing analytics, but having an overview of what commercially is important, means that in my work now as a senior advisor, I'm working with private equity houses. I'm on a bit of a mission, I think quite successfully so far, to re-educate the industry that CAC is a bad metric and CLTV is a bad metric.
Yeah, well, there's going to be a lot of people getting back to the drawing board and potentially rethinking. But this is where I love the podcast, because it allows people to rethink some of their assumptions, and just think about, okay, how can I implement that same thinking on engagements I'm working on? One thing I kind of wanted to get you to quickly speak about, I've got some other questions about OC&C and some other stuff as well, but is project management. Right. So obviously the data piece is important, systems are important, but executing this in a project is obviously important as well. What are some tips that you can share around kind of how you think about successfully implementing projects?
Yes. So I think both in an in-house context where I've seen clients to work in-house, and then as a consultant, I think the same lessons apply. And that macro lesson is, broadly speaking, taking your stakeholders on the journey with you, in terms of the journey of the project.
Yeah.
And that journey has multiple steps, but the first step is really around data validation. So are you using the right data? So to give an example, I do a lot of work with retailers. Retailers have many definitions of margin, particularly supermarkets. Does it include wastage? Does it include return product? Does it include activity-based costing and restacking the shelves? It's a category like bread, for example. And so what definition of margin are you using? If you're looking at advertising spend, famously, is it gross or net? If you're looking at CAC type net metrics, do you include agency fees or just working dollars? So it's important that everyone in the project agrees that you're using the right data. And then you really have to play that data back to the stakeholders in a data book, whether virtual or literally a book, where you kind of graph that data and show the stakeholders, hey, it's really interesting. What happened last July? Why were your sales down? What was going on? So that's sort of stage one, is to agree that the data foundations which you're using for the analytics actually is the right set of data.
Yeah.
I think the second part of the process is around agreeing the framework. So we talked a little bit around getting the framework right. So it's not just a question of price elasticity. It's a question of, are we including cannibalization? It's not just a question of advertising effects in year one, but are we looking at the long-term effects of advertising in year 2, year 3 in terms of brand building? And is that incorporated into the decision framework? So with your stakeholders, you've got to agree this decision model, is it sales or more profit? Is it 1 year? Is it 3 year? Are we including cannibalization effects or not? So those kind of decisions are very important in terms of agreeing the framework. And then thirdly, and only thirdly, is then the actual analytics and data science in terms of, well, what do you need to calibrate that framework? Okay, I need a response curve for the advertising. I need to understand the carryover effects. I need to understand the cross-portfolio effects in terms of how brands might substitute or support each other. And what's important is that at that point, the stakeholders agree your price elasticities, your cannibalization, or they agree the advertising response curves. Because what happens in the fourth stage is that you build your simulation model that you optimize. And in the optimization, you have winners and losers. If we say we have $100 million of advertising spend, and we want to allocate that across a brand portfolio, some of those brands are going to lose advertising support. Some are going to gain advertising support. And you need the people who are losing their advertising support to understand the rationale for that, because they've been through the process of understanding this is the right data, this is the right framework. And yes, I agree, the shape of advertising response curve that, oh yes, reluctantly I accept that my brand has a lower response curve than, someone else's brand in the portfolio. And then similarly, I've worked with a lot of retailers around things like SKU mix, pricing, promo, category management, if you like. And you take the results of your analytics into a workshop where you might say, well, look, naturally, this is the SKU we should delist. It's highly cannibalistic. It's low margin. People will fight, hey, it's my favorite cheese, or that's the coffee I buy. And so you got to fight, they'll fight for it.
Yeah.
And you got to be able to defend your analytics and say, well, look, there's a logic flow here. You agreed the data. Yeah. You agreed the framework we're using, that we're saying we don't like cannibalistic SKUs. And you agree the framework that, oh yeah, the price elasticity is really high. And, if we increase the price, no one's going to buy the product. So you've got to take your client, whether literally as a consultant, your client, or internally your stakeholders, on that journey, each step of the way. And then I think at the end, there has to be an implementation plan. So you can't stop with your research recommendation. Oh, hey, here's a report that says, spend more money on TV and less on, digital, or spend less money on brand A and more money on brand B. You actually have to say, like, here's our 18-month transition plan. Here's what we have to do. Here are the people who are responsible. It's a racy, in terms of who's responsible, accountable, and so on. A time-bound plan. And so there are, these 5 stages to the project that you have to have signed off, if you like, before you move to the next stage of the project. And certainly as a consultant, I think there's a really interesting test, which is, would the client pay for each of those components as an individual project? So would the client pay for what you're doing in terms of building up the data set and saying, hey, look, we've seen some interesting patterns in the data. Would they pay for you building a decision framework that is looking at, well, what is the logic structure for price elasticity, cannibalization, and margin? Would they pay for a retrospective, backward-looking view of advertising effectiveness? Would they pay for the simulation model that says, no, let's optimize how we spend the money? And then would they pay for the implementation plan? So would they actually pay for those 5 modules if they were charged for separately? I think that's a really interesting test.
And the importance of being on the same page right at the outset as well is obviously vital, as you've alluded to. And just as we kind of wrap up our time here, I wanted to just ask you a couple of questions on the last 7 years, right? OC&C, how did you get the job?
A fantastic headhunter.
Exactly. And how you got the job, but then how you've kind of managed to grow that into a global team, and also just, I guess, some reflections on the partnership as well, which I think is quite a unique partnership in the strategy and consulting landscape.
Yes, so in terms of getting the job, of course, yes, I did have a great headhunter who pitched me in. And I think it was a bit of a pitch into OC&C in terms of what analytics could bring to the strategy context. And there were a set of perhaps skeptical partners to win over before joining and then after joining. So I think I succeeded in doing some of the things we talked about earlier about, well, what is incremental, but not too crazy that it risks organ rejection. And I think I could point to examples of proposition development and analogous to, what we could do at OC&C. I think, secondly, of course, David Zed, who is Chief Analytics Officer, he was actually there just before me. And I think we have forged a fantastic partnership in terms of David being, if you like, more the classic Chief Analytics Officer and more technical, and me being a little bit more around proposition development and teaming with my partners, my former partners, and building out the team and being a cheerleader for the analytics team. And then I think as we grew the team, what was important is balancing with the team something which I think is unique, where we built a hybrid team, where those people were strategy consultants who had to pass their strategy consultant case study interviews, which are never easy. How many balloons are there in Paris, or how many coffee plants in the world to give away to case study secrets? And then obviously a coding test, and actually do you know anything about analytics? So partly being able to be a credible strategy consultant, and then actually to be a sort of nerdy analytics person who wanted to do analytics and wanted to be part of this, I guess, sort of pioneering group. We were certainly initially, a pirate ship on the sort of high seas of OC&C. And I think, I was very lucky that I had some highly supportive partners and built actually some really great friendships, perhaps with some partners, I won't name names, but partners who were not necessarily obvious bedfellows in terms of being friends or collaborators, but we ended up doing a lot of work together. And again, I think it does come down to building relationships at a very human level. That probably is the advice I have for the youngsters, but also for incoming partners. Your successful failure is on the, likability probably beats capability or competency. So that is a bit of a mantra, I think, in terms of, building and being successful at the human level. And then I think as that team has matured in London, obviously we've been able to build out the pyramid. It's hard work because we have people who are highly in demand and they go off and work in PE houses to build out analytics teams, or indeed go off and start their own analytics shops, which I'm incredibly supportive of. But
of course,
great people go off and do great things. But what's great now is, we have 2 guys in Sydney, for example, who we're teaming with, particularly around actually the sort of digital diligence proposition, sort of proposition-based work where analytics can bring a lot of value to deals work. And I think, probably the other thing to say around that success story is that there are definitely generations of people. And there was a generation of people who first joined, who were sort of pioneers like us. And they were a little bit spikier, a little bit more interesting. Not the current team are interesting, but they were certainly spikier in terms of non-consulting, like rough edges. But that's what you want on a pirate ship. You need some people who are, interesting and have different views and are going to fight for the kind of work that they think are, is important. And then we had a generation of people as we got bigger who I think were important around developing our propositions and had repeatability of credible propositions. And I think the current generation has got really successful at dovetailing with the rest of OC&C and sort of being seamless in terms of working highly successfully on OC&C projects. So we don't do analytics projects, by the way, if that's not obvious. OC&C only ever does analytics projects where you have analytics and strategy blended together. Yeah. So it might be with a retailer or the e-comm, or it could be a diligence project where analytics and people are part of the team. But I don't think the client particularly would notice who's who. Yeah. It's not like an aircraft carrier where people have different colored jackets. The refueling guy versus the armoring guy. Yeah. And so I think, there are different generations we've been through in terms of how people have contributed. The first generation being a bit more aggressive, if you like, in terms of building something new. Yeah. The second generation being around building the propositions. And I think now at a sort of state of maturity, people who are very much OC&C type people who blend into OC&C and could be highly successful, frankly, either in an analytics context or just, dare I say, just in a strategy context.
No, and like I think it as a leader, there's importance in kind of knowing where you're at in the cycle as well, because you can kind of adapt and adjust as per, and also what type of talent is needed for each part of the cycle. So what is James Walker doing now? And what is next for James Walker? What's the next adventure?
Adventures are all important. Yeah. So I have retired since last October full-time from OC&C. So I departnered and left the partnership, and I'm currently supporting the firm finding my replacement. I still work as a senior advisor to OC&C, and they've got me working on some quite interesting projects, which is great. I am working with a PE house. Yeah. Again, part of my approved exit from OC&C. So working very much around some of the things we've talked about in terms of e-comm, advertising effectiveness, metrics, and so on. And it's great to sort of be a little bit more in the belly of the beast as opposed to, sitting outside, which is great. I am obviously helping David a little bit with data vision, more as an investor and helping hand as opposed to actually working on any projects, but sort of keeping a sort of watchful eye. And then I think most interestingly, a long-time collaborator, Glenn Granger, who I've known for more than 35 years, worked together in different contexts, different places along the way. He has also had a very successful career in analytics and then more recently in software. He and I are getting together to create a analytics exec training business. I say business. It is more around the idea of having a roadshow. I see myself and Glenn as a bit like sort of you two on tour. We want to be, a couple of dates in Sydney, a couple in Singapore, Dubai, London, New York, Zurich when it's skiing time. And we are focusing a little bit more on the idea of frameworks and project management, some of the things we've been talking about, the intersection of analytics and commercial capabilities. And I think we're aiming at people who are at the transition from an analyst doing analytics to be more of a project manager, thinking about frameworks and thinking about project management. And face-to-face course. And of course, I think that training business will then beget all kinds of opportunities to get involved with training, excos about analytics, the coming AI opportunity, and so on. So I think it's all about continuing to add value and be a significant person in the world of analytics.
Yeah.
My vanity would demand that. But certainly about having adventures.
Yeah. No, well, it sounds like it. And it's wonderful that, it's not the end of James Walker. There's going to be another iteration almost. And I'm sure that there'll be a lot of value added by yourself and Glenn. The last question I want to ask you, and I ask all my guests as we wrap up here, a very broad question, one that may have a bit of a complex answer, but what is the best piece of career advice that you've received along the way?
That I've received?
Yeah.
I've certainly given a lot.
Yeah.
I think, again, my former OC&C youngsters will know. Can I have two?
You can have two.
So the first is to go back what we talked about. And I say it semi-jokingly, but I think it is serious, around likability versus competence or capability. And it's probably not strictly true, of course. But I do think those people skills are really important.
Yeah.
And working successfully at the human level, I think does trump, no matter how great you are, analytics, no matter how great your ideas are.
Yeah.
So that's a sort of semi-serious throwaway piece of advice. I think a more complicated piece of advice is for the young partner. And I think you often think about the success of your career being around selling work or having a portfolio of projects in your platform, or even about how you deliver projects. But I think the value you really add as a successful partner and what determines your success is what you do and how successfully you intervene when projects go wrong. Certainly in a bigger company, Big Four, Accenture, your success is determined by the machine. You are to an extent going to sell work. You are going to deliver projects because you have a whole sales machine that supports you. But where you stand on your own 2 feet and you may succeed or fail is when projects have a glitch, and all projects go wrong.
Yeah.
All projects have a problem, and your ability to intervene rapidly and sort out your team, sort out the client, get the project back on track, apologize if you need to or not, depending on what the glitch is. Fight for your project, fight for the team, perhaps.
Yeah.
It's not always something you've done wrong. Being able to get your project on track and then build your reputation even stronger from that kind of service recovery, I think is really important. And I think clients remember that a lot. And I think your colleagues remember it a lot. So I think what happens every day in business is usual. Yeah, sure, it's important. You have to sell work, deliver work, build your team. But I think in those moments of high stress and those moments when projects go wrong and you're able to get something back on track, I think that's when the heroes are made that people talk about. And I think that is my advice for young partners or associate partners, directors,
fantastic.
Coming up in a firm.
What do you do when it goes wrong? That's what matters. Well, James, it's been an absolute pleasure. I'm very excited and interested to see what you do next as it relates to this trading business and what you continue to do with PE houses. We might have to get you back on, but thanks so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure. I'll link all of your details and who you are down in the description for those who have been living under a rock. But again, it's been a pleasure and look forward to seeing what you achieve next.
Great. Thanks, Joseph. It's been great.
Thank you so much for watching till the end of that episode. Hopefully you found value in that episode. And if you did, then don't forget to subscribe, follow, and also share this episode with others. And if you would like to know more about what we do here at 633, which is to help data professionals find work and help amazing organizations hire technical talent, so don't hesitate to get in touch.